Hello, welcome to what I believe is my third Patreon teaching video. A number of things have happened since I did my last one. I skipped last week because I've been obsessing over working on editing this worldview book. I got a haircut and got a new shirt, Cleveland Browns. I'm getting in on the low run. I'm going to root for them so when they do make it to the Super Bowl, I can say I was there from the beginning. It's a Cub thing. You get in with the losers until they do well. Anyway, like I said, I've been working on this my worldview book that I'm trying to finish and hopefully get it done by the end of the year, early next year. And I'm in the midst of editing it, and I'm getting like in the 19th, 20th century worth of stuff, and it's just been kind of tedious. So that's why I didn't get to making a video last week. But as I was thinking about it, I was thinking I could maybe ask you for some suggestions. Originally, the title of the book, it was like a working title called The Ways of the Worldviews, because it's about worldviews. It's kind of a play on words of that's the way of the world. But I don't know if I liked it. And so I was working with the guy who's publishing it, my publisher, and as of now, this is what it's called. I don't know if I like it. You can let me know. Christianity and the, in the parentheses, R, revolution, like revolution, evolution. Christianity and the revolution of worldviews in Western culture, with a subtitle of A Brief Overview of Christianity and the Development of Western Civilization and Why It Is So Important to Understand If One Is Going to Make Sense of Our World Today. Anyway, I want to think of a catchy title, so if you kind of come up with an idea, I want to have something to do, the title has to do with Christianity, Western culture, worldviews. Those are the big things that I want to somehow work into the title in a creative way. So if you have any suggestions, please send me an email. And hey, if I pick your title, maybe I'll like mention you at the beginning of the book. You could be the title master. Anyway, today I am going to try to finish up a few things about the Abraham story, and I'll kind of tell you a little bit about how that ends and how the Jacob cycle begins. We're kind of going through Genesis, kind of giving you the big picture of everything. And last time, I believe I sent you the PDF file of that Abraham chart that I made, and we talked about how chapters 12 to 19 kind of follow a storytelling pattern, which kind of helps you make sense of how it is put together. Once you get to chapter 20 to 25, the rest of the Abraham cycle, there's just a number of stories that people don't really focus on, with the exception of a few big ones. But a big chunk of it is kind of glossed over. So I'm going to kind of talk you through it and kind of just say a few things that might be interesting. After chapter 19, the story of Lot and his daughters, chapter 20 starts with this story, which should sound kind of familiar if you paid attention last time, or if you ever read your Bible. Abraham goes into another area, and he's afraid, once again, that the people of the area, whose leader is Abimelech, that they're going to kill him and take Sarah because she's so beautiful, even though she's like, probably 90. And so he lies about that, says, he's her brother. Abimelech takes, whoops, that was my phone. Abimelech takes her and then is warned not to, take her. And so Abimelech confronts Abraham, and again, why'd you do this? Abraham said, I was afraid you were going to kill me. And long story short, they kind of make up and they kind of create kind of an alliance. Now, obviously, that sounds a lot like what Abraham and Sarah did when they went down to Egypt in 12:10 to 13:1. So it's another scene that's kind of similar. And there's, scholars kind of speculate on what it could mean. I'll be honest, I'm not sure everything it could mean, but it's worth noting that that once again this initial confrontation leads to good fortune for Abraham. in any case, after that story in chapter 20, the bulk of 21, in fact, chapter 21, 1 to 21, a lot of 21s there, is about the birth of Isaac, the child of promise. Now, earlier, you have to see this in context of the whole Abrahamic covenant. You know, God has promised that he's going to make a great nation out of Abraham. Through that nation, all nations will be blessed. They're going to live in the promised land. He's going to have many descendants. And then at one point in chapter 18, God actually shows up to Abraham and promises him specifically, by this time next year, your wife Sarah is going to have a child, which is kind of crazy because she's old, and normally old women can't have children. And Abraham had tried with her handmaid Hagar, and he did have a son, Ishmael, but he was kind of conceived the old-fashioned way, if you know what I mean. And so he's not the child of promise. The child of promise comes from the barren womb of Sarah, and this is Isaac. Now, the name Isaac means laughter, and the reason why he is called Isaac, again, it goes back to that scene in chapter 18, 1 to 15, when the three visitors show up to Abraham and promise him that Sarah's going to have a child. She laughs because it's so ridiculous. And so here, now that she actually has a child, they name the child Laughter, because it's kind of an inside joke. Hey, look at me, I'm an old woman and I got a kid, woohoo! So, in any case, Isaac, the child of promise, is born, and because of that, and if you look in the chart, you kind of see this thing going on. Everything in the bottom, that bottom row, which is in blue if you got it, if you printed it off in color, involves some kind of tension and division. And so in chapter 21, with the birth of Isaac, there is this tension and division, rivalry between Isaac and Ishmael, between Sarah and Hagar again. It's kind of, that rivalry revives. And we are told that Hagar and Ishmael are expelled from Abraham's camp, but that God is going to nevertheless provide for Hagar and Ishmael and make Ishmael a mighty nation later on. So that, once again, is kind of a division thing because God's going to focus on the child of promise. The second half of chapter 22 takes us back to Abimelech. And Abimelech and Abraham basically have an argument over a well. And after their initial argument, they do come together and they make a covenant and they kind of resolve their differences. It's an interesting thing. This is kind of a side note, but throughout the Old Testament, particularly in the Pentateuch, but definitely throughout the Old Testament narratives, anytime somebody comes to a well, more times than not, there's something to do with marriage is going to happen pretty soon. And you're going to see that really soon, in fact, with the Isaac and Rebekah story. But this Abimelech well story, honestly, I'm not sure what to make of it. Other than there is, like we said, a connection between his encounter with Abimelech and his encounter with Pharaoh earlier. But then this well scene of this initial tension, it does kind of lead into what will become Abraham finding the wife for Isaac. So maybe there's some kind of foreshadowing with that. But the point is, anytime you read in the Bible of a well, not every time, but a lot, there's some kind of matrimonial marriage coming up. And so maybe this could be a foreshadowing of what comes up in the next chapter. But anyway, so what you see is you have this encounter with Abimelech, the birth of Isaac, the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael, Abimelech and the well confrontation. And then in chapter 22, we have one of the most famous passages in the Abraham cycle, and this is about the sacrifice of Isaac, or the almost sacrifice of Isaac. And you probably know the story well enough, is that after all this, all this hassle to try to even get Isaac born, this miraculous child, and God's promise that it's through this child of promise that he's going to fulfill his covenant with Abraham, all of a sudden, God tells Abraham, all right, now I want you to take your son and I want you to kill him. Sometimes we're so familiar with the story we don't get how scandalous that story is. And sometimes it's so scandalous that some people, more skeptics or atheists or something like that, they say, "Oh, how can you worship a God who would tell Abraham to sacrifice his own son? How barbaric!" And then you come back with, "Well, he actually didn't sacrifice his son. But what was the psychological tension of taking him? Oh my gosh, how would you feel if you were Isaac?" Blah 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 blah. The problem with that mindset is you're reading the story through kind of our modern lens, and we have to read it through the lens of the ancient Near East. And the fact is, in the ancient Near East, in Canaan, for example, child sacrifice was kind of an accepted practice. I don't think it happened every day, but it was a Canaanite practice. And so what you need to realize with the sacrifice of Isaac, the emphasis really is on the end. Abraham is asked to sacrifice Isaac. In the end, God makes it clear that he doesn't want him to sacrifice his son. In the end, when you look at that story in the context of ancient Canaan, the emphasis is this God of Abraham actually doesn't demand child sacrifice. It's a challenge to that Canaanite way of thinking. Now, at the same time, it is a story, so like any good story, it has to have a build-up, a tension, but the result is that point that God doesn't require child sacrifice, but he wants that faith of Abraham who would be willing to do it and have trust that God could somehow still bring about his promises through Isaac. In fact, that is what the Apostle Paul says in the New Testament, I think it's in Romans, when he talks about the faith of Abraham, that even though God asked him to sacrifice Isaac, that Abraham's faith in God was so strong that he believed that God would raise Isaac from the dead. And Paul makes this connection between that kind of faith that in Abraham, God being able to raise the dead from Isaac, just like he brought forth life out of the dead womb of Sarah, and he equates that with putting faith in Jesus, whom God rose from the dead. And so Paul makes that connection in his letters. Now, granted, in this particular story in chapter 22, it doesn't emphasize that specific thing. That it doesn't say that Abraham thought God would raise Isaac from the dead here in the story. Paul says that about the story when he elaborates on that passage. But in any case, when God lets Abraham know he's not going to want Isaac sacrificed, they find a ram in the bush and they sacrifice the ram instead. And the covenant that he made with Abraham is confirmed. And it's kind of a test of Abraham's faith in the covenant. And that's the point. And from this point on, it's clear that it's through Isaac that God is going to keep his promises of the covenant. Now, interesting thing about Isaac is that, like I mentioned, in Genesis, you have three big cycles of stories. You have the Abraham cycle, the Jacob cycle, and then the Joseph cycle. You might be wondering, why doesn't Isaac get his own cycle of stories? He just doesn't. He is always kind of like this, shadowy figure who just kind of hangs out in the background. And it's really interesting when you look at the character of Isaac. He's a very passive character. I mean, it starts right with the sacrifice of Isaac. This old man Abraham just binds the son and gets ready to sacrifice him, and Isaac is kind of powerless. And then a little later, like we'll find, Abraham has to find a son for Isaac. Isaac kind of just hanging out at home, letting Daddy do everything for him. And then later on with the story of Jacob and Esau, Isaac gets deceived a couple times by Jacob. He's just kind of hangs out in the background. He doesn't really have an active role in the story of the patriarchs. But he's there, but he's just a very passive figure. Anyway, after the sacrifice of Isaac, the last couple chapters about the Abraham cycle really kind of wrap things up. You learn at the end of chapter 22 that Abraham does have other sons and daughters, there's other births. Chapter 23 is the death of Sarah. And then chapter 24 is the interesting story where Abraham has to find a wife for Isaac. Sarah's dead, and so he wants to find a wife for Isaac. So what he does is he doesn't, and this is a theme all throughout the author of Genesis, Abraham's family does not marry Canaanites. They're not supposed to. He sends his servant back to Aram, like his homeland, to find a wife for Isaac from his own people. And so in chapter 24, you have this story, and a lot of people know it, where the servant goes back to their homeland, and he prays to Yahweh to help him find a wife for Isaac. And he goes back to the homeland, and he goes to a well, and he prays to Yahweh to help him find a wife for Isaac. And he basically says, whatever girl comes and offers to give me a drink and water my camels, that'll be the one. And sure enough, Rebecca shows up, and she does those very things. And so the servant then takes out the rings and jewelry and presents them to her and basically tells her that, hey, I'm a servant of Abraham. He wants you to marry his son. She takes him back to her father, Laban, and they agree. So Rebecca goes back with the servant back to Canaan to be the wife for Isaac. And then at the end of chapter 24, we have the scene where Isaac is waiting at home for the woman to show up, and she comes back with the servant, and they get married. But again, that's that scene of there's a well. Whenever there's a meeting of a man with a woman at a well, chances are in some form there's going to be a marriage in the foreseeable future. Chapter 25 really wraps up the Abraham story. At the beginning of chapter 25, you find out that he ended up having other wives and sons. And then in chapter 25, 7 through 11, is the death of Abraham. Now the transition to the next cycle of stories is at the end of chapter 25, where we are first introduced, after we're told about Ishmael's line, genealogical line, at the very end of chapter 25, in 19 to 34, we are told of the birth of Jacob and Esau. Rebekah is pregnant with twins. Esau comes out first, and he's like red and hairy, and he's like a manly man from the time he's born. Actually, there was a funny Saturday Night Live skit years ago with Will Ferrell involving a woman, Rachel Dratch, giving birth, and she gives birth to Will Ferrell, who's like a full-grown man with a mustache. And every time I read the Esau story, I kind of think of that. He's just like hairy and masculine from the very beginning. But the important thing is, even though Esau is born first, we are told that Jacob comes out literally on his heels, grasping his heel. And therefore, they named Jacob, that's why they named Jacob Jacob. Jacob means heel grabber. And this defines who he is throughout his life. A heel grabber means you trip somebody up, by their heels. You're a deceiver. You're willing to do whatever you can to trip up that guy and get ahead of him. And that kind of is what Jacob is all about. And as we'll find out next time when we go through the Jacob story, Jacob is a deceiver from the very beginning. His whole family is deceivers. Deception is like the main word for understanding the Jacob cycle, which is going to take us from, I think, 26 to 36. But here at the very opening of this scene, of the Jacob cycle, is this birth of Jacob and Esau, and the significance of the heel grabber and all that stuff. It's to fulfill the word of the Lord that came to Rebekah in 25:23. It says, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. one shall be stronger than the other, but the older shall serve the younger. So once again, you have this division of peoples. And again, it kind of goes back to the very thing in Genesis 3 about the war of the offspring. That when God chooses to work in history through a particular person and through a particular people, that means other people are not going to be it. And so there's this division that happens even within the womb of Rebecca. And we are told that the older will serve the younger. So even though they're technically twins, even though they're twins, Jacob is technically younger because he came out second. And God's going to work through Jacob. And it's important to realize because Jacob is, like I said, a deceiving, bad person in a lot of ways. And this is one of the things you get in Genesis, is God doesn't choose what we consider godly people all the time. In fact, most of the time he doesn't. Jacob is a pretty screwed up guy, and we'll find more out about him next week when I walk you through his story, and that might take 2 weeks because there's so much good stuff with the Jacob story. But we're going to start it next week with the story of Esau selling his birthright to Jacob, the first example of Jacob tripping up his older brother to get what he wants. So, any case, if you have any ideas for my worldview book, please send me a message. Throw some ideas out. Let me work with me on, let's try to get a good title. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will make another post on Jacob next week. Thanks.